There is absolute fear and trembling by liberal political establishment to address issues pertaining to theology and religion because they just don't want to go there. They would much rather speak about these issues in terms of social, socio-economic, even cultural practices. But the idea that it might in any way, shape or form be linked to materials that are found in Islamic sources, for example, in primary textual sources, or that there might be theological mandates for this kind of behaviour. That's something that people just absolutely don't want to talk about within our British political establishment. And I think that's kind of evading a God-given commitment that we as religious believers all have to speaking truthfully and with candour into these issues.
And you also mentioned absolutely the politicians, political church leaders as well, perhaps trying to silence the debate, but we need to talk about it freely. It all needs to be out there in the open.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, there's what you might call kind of an interfaith industry, which is it has a kind of an outward manifestation in sort of tea and samosas and nice chat, and essentially it plays to a political culture that really just wants to smooth over and gloss over some of these very difficult questions, because there is no escaping the fact that in Rotherham and in Rochdale, what we saw were not just social phenomena or cultural phenomena or manifestations of socioeconomic poverty, or indeed just Pakistani immigrant culture. What we saw in the language of the perpetrators were Islamic theological terms. They used the language of kafira, of unbeliever women. And there are theological mandates that are propagated through Saudi religious clerics that spoke of how slavery is part of jihad, and jihad will forever be part of Islam. For some who follow a Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, the world is divided into two spheres. There's the Dar es-Salam, the abode of peace under Islamic jurisdiction, and there is the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war. And there is a debate as to whether Western countries where Muslims, as far as I'm concerned, enjoy human rights and religious freedoms, such as Britain and the European continent and North America, whether they also are Dar al-Harb. Because what's relevant to this discourse is that under the juristic terms of Dar al-Harb, according to those particular readings, the women, the non-Muslim women, can be taken as as ma malakat aymanukum, to use the Arabic terminology, as those who are captive, bonded women, as it was sort of spoils of war. And if you listen to the transcripts of the perpetrators in Rotherham and Rochdale, that's the kind of language that's being used. It isn't cultural or tribal language alone. I realise it's multifactorial and there may be some determinants there, but it is also very significantly language that at one level or another is being inspired through Islamic theology or particular readings of Islamic theology.
So how can the situation be alleviated? It is really down to our political leaders, isn't it, to speak out and to say, actually, this is not acceptable. I mean, you also went on to talk about the fact that our governments are colluding inadvertently, yes, perhaps, yes, to slavery.
Yes, I think one of the key themes that came out of today were the wonderful sort of narratives by very brave, much braver colleagues than I, brave colleagues who are working on the chalk face in India and in Africa with organisations and with slave owners, and one thing that came out very strongly was the idea that we might actually be colluding with these practices of slavery through, for example, the consumer choices that we make around the sort of goods that we buy. But I would add to that one of the most imminent and immediate ways in which we collude with slavery is through the collusion that we have with the foreign policy decisions that our government have made in regard to its allegiance and its alliance, this kind of marriage of convenience that it has with Saudi Arabia. I spoke out in support quite recently of Margot Wallström's criticism, Margot Wallström being the Swedish foreign minister, her criticisms of the injustice of the Saudi judicial system and how it is a slave society. It's an apartheid society like no other in many respects. And indentured, bonded slavery in one shape or form is something that either in theory or in practice continues to obtain in certain wealthy Gulf states. And it really grieves me, and it actually makes me quite angry that a nation that has a foreign policy unit committed to promoting democracy, and we keep getting told that human rights is a fundamental plinth of our foreign policy relationships with all countries, is nonetheless in bed with, in a rather cozy way, with the Saudi royal family, and with what is essentially a brutal apartheid society, a slave mandated society that means that we ally ourselves with the source, the absolute fount of Islamist Wahhabi extremism in Saudi Arabia, in order to fight other forms of religious extremism. I think that's not an alliance. That's not an alliance ordained by God. I think it's kind of a Faustian pact with the devil, actually.
I dread to think what you thought when you saw the flags flying at half-mast over Parliament.
Well, I think the sentiments of disgust and outrage that have been expressed by many ordinary British people, just ordinary women and men in this country, say it far more articulate than I could. I think it's an absolute disgrace that the mother of democracies has kind of doffed its cap to one of the most despotic and brutal regimes of our time.